this leads me to my next question. Jiu-jitsu in India. Now, before you were saying that wrestling or fighting came from India?
Well, all cultures have their own grappling traditions. Pretty much, I can't really think of, I mean, everyone knows that the Greco-Roman sort of tradition, Persian wrestling and things like that, and that's they know that's all connected because that's all from the same part of the world. But when I was traveling in India, I was lucky enough to meet different people who were involved in anthropological, archaeological investigations through their university studies. Finding all sorts of proof of a grappling and fighting culture that existed in India predating Greco-Persian wrestling and grappling. And it would also indicate that, you know, a lot of that tradition came from India and then was spread through, you know, Asia Minor into, you know, Europe. Places like that. So temples that you'd see reliefs of wrestlers performing leg locks and foot locks on each other, things like that, that predate Persian Greco culture. Stories, histories like the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, which were essentially about warriors and their exploits, not just in large-scale wars, but also single combat with one another. And the great fighters and warriors that engaged in those activities with one another and the things that they used to do to train for that. There's so many, some of these stories became, especially from the Mahabharata, which is the very ancient story from India, more than 5,000 years old. And it tells a story of two families, two sides of one family it was like a fratricidal war. They were feuding against one another. And one group of brothers, they overcame their cousins in this battle. But the whole story of their being brought up together and training together, and then all their exploits in conquering different parts of the known world at that time, and then later on them fighting one another. But the stories are amazing, and they became a meditation for me when I used to go into competitions. I used to imagine these stories in my mind and remember these stories, and they used to motivate me in my competition times or competition days. These great warriors, like one example is, I was just telling a friend the other day, I'm building at the moment and building a house, and I was telling the builder about we were talking about, he knew of the Mahabharata as well, and we were talking about a great warrior called Arjuna. I don't know if you've heard of this. So Arjuna was speaking to Krishna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, and this became the Bhagavad Gita, which is the story of, is a discourse of Krishna giving Arjuna knowledge about his consciousness, about karma, yoga, self-realization, all of these things. It's a 720-verse treatise that was spoken on just before a battle occurred. So Arjuna was considered one of the greatest warriors in Indian culture, and he had very much a focus, a one-pointed determination on achieving perfection in archery. And there's a story about his teacher, Drona Acharya, testing all of his students, and they're all lining up, and there's a bird, not a picture, a cutout of a bird in a tree, and they're all lining up to shoot this bird in the tree. And the teacher goes to each one of his students and he says, "What do you see?" And each one of the students answers, "Well, I see a tree." He said, "What else do you see?" "I see a bird." "Do you see anything else?" "I see the sky beyond the tree." And they all answer in this way, down the line. They've got their bows and their arrows ready to shoot. And every time he asked them that question, they fail. He said, "Stand down. You're not ready to fire at the bird." So he finally gets to Arjuna and he says, "What do you see?" And the bird is in the tree there. He sees it. And he said, I see an eye." And he said, "You see an eye? An eye of what?" I said, "I see the eye of the bird. I don't see the tree. He said, what else do you see? I said, I see nothing else. I don't see the tree. I don't see the bird. I only see the eye of the bird. Shoot. So stories like that from the Mahabharata used to motivate me very much so when I was competing and training to compete. These warriors that were elite level, and they practiced things like, in Sanskrit, jiu-jitsu is called yujutsu or yuyutsava. You find that in the Bhagavad Gita as well. This word yuyutsava, and it means desire to fight. So very simply, you can see how that relates to jiu-jitsu. Yujutsu, jiu-jitsu. So they practiced in India these martial arts, obviously to protect themselves for thousands of years, and they were perfected over a long period of time of warfare and fighting, and these were teachings that were passed down from generation to generation. And just like now we have our jiu-jitsu martial teachers, my teacher is Peter Devine. A warrior would go to his teacher who had a lifetime of experience and knowledge, and he would teach them the martial arts. And then, in time, they may become a teacher themselves. So the jiu-jitsu was yujutsu, and another name for grappling in India is kushti. Malayud is another name. There's a scripture, I think, on Malayud you can find, and it talks about different styles. Have you heard of Garuda? He's the giant eagle. They named Balinese airlines after Garuda.
Oh, Garuda, yeah.
Yeah, Garuda. See, he's an enormous bird from the Mahabharata as well, and he's a personality. Hanuman. Have you heard of Hanuman?
Yeah.
Hanuman is the monkey god.
Yep.
So there's different styles that were taught under these different primary teachers, like Garuda and Hanuman and so forth. And Hanuman is worshipped. He's worshipped by all wrestlers in India to this day. So the teachings were taught and delineated and extrapolated, interpolated, things were added to. And then when Buddhism became prominent in India, it then moved into China. And then they took those teachings to China from India. And then, of course, we know Buddhism eventually went to Japan. And they're very precise about what they do. The Japanese, they take something and they keep it, pure. If they grow an apple on a tree, they cut all the other apples off the branch, and they just have that one apple on the branch, and all the goodness from that branch goes into that apple. And then they sell that. That's the perfection of apples. And rather than having 100 apples, they got one apple. And that's the juiciest, tastiest apple. So they kept this knowledge, and they protected it, and they refined it, and they when they went to Brazil, then they took it to Brazil, and then the Brazilians made it even better. So we're really fortunate the Japanese actually preserved it, because you don't find Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in India anymore. You don't find it in China. It was only in Japan that it was kept, and then to the point where they asked a swami, a sannyasi, 100 years ago in the 1920s, one of his disciples asked him, where can you find real martial arts these days? And he said, the only place you'll find it is in Japan. Everywhere else it's lost. They kept that disciplic succession pure, and they passed it down uninterrupted until we got to Brazil, and then, of course, it was taken all over the world.